The strange story of the discovery and censorship of Anaïs Nin's lost erotica begins with my friendship with her literary agent, Gunther Stuhlman, seen here on the right. In the years after he passed in 2002, his wife Barbara sent me several of his own files, one of which was a folder labeled erotica with a question mark. In it were some Xeroxes that shocked and intrigued me. The first item was a 1986 letter to Nin executor Rupert Pohl from Harris Auction Galleries that indicated that they were preparing a prospectus for a previously unknown volume of erotica they were going to auction off. The letter was an appeal for an educated opinion whether the author was Anais Nin. The first Xerox was of the title page. Electress is a word that sounds unlike any that Nin had used in the past, but A. Nin is listed as the author. Electress is divided into two books, Life in Provincetown and Marcel, the latter of which is the title of a short story from Nin's Delta of Venus. Life in Provincetown was unknown to any of the leading Nin authorities at the time. The next Xerox shows that Electress was reproduced on latrine rag, otherwise known as onion skin, in an edition of 5 copies by the Press of the Sunken Eye. The listed year of publication, 1950, is nearly a decade after Nin had written her final $1-a-page erotic stories. Harris reproduced about a half dozen of the first pages of both books, including the unknown Life in Provincetown. When I read those pages, I was flabbergasted. While I had never read this material before, there was no doubt this was classic Nin erotica. No one else wrote like this. And to further certify the notion of Nin as author, the first pages of Marcel that were provided were easily determined to be the unedited version of what appears in Delta of Venus. Subsequent correspondence between Pohl, Stuhlman, and Nin's Harcourt editor, John Herron, indicates they all felt the same way. They agreed that both books were Nin's. If Nin had authored this previously unknown work, why did no one suggest publishing it like Delta of Venus or Little Birds back in 1986? Why did it remain unknown to the public for another 30 years? The answer is probably because in 1986, the first unexpurgated diary was coming out, and no one wanted to do anything that would steal that spotlight. And as we know, Henry and June got that spotlight and became a popular seller that was later made into a movie. No one can argue about the strategy used at the time. But Life in Provincetown was worthy of publication, and so was Marcel, because it was the complete story before it was carved up into several others that were published in Delta of Venus and Little Birds. So, 30 years later, I felt there was an obligation to publish Electress, and I set out to do it. But first, I needed a complete copy. During my search for Electress, I amazingly found one hiding in plain sight at UCLA's Special Collections. I requested it and received a PDF of the entire book. I was in business. I found the copy in the George Howard collection. I'd never heard of him. Who was he, and how did he get this book? I think a flow chart is in order. As you probably know, Nin was writing erotica at $1 a page in the early 1940s to make ends meet. She passed her work on to Barnett Reuter, who claimed to send it to a collector down south. Whether that collector ever existed is still up for debate. Henry Miller claimed that Reuter may have been the collector himself. Nevertheless, the contents of Electress went to Reuter probably in 1940. But in 1941, Miller asked Nin to send his Los Angeles friend George Howard carvings of the erotica she wrote for Reuter, because he thought that Howard could sell them plus Miller's own erotica. Howard did sell them to a man named Milton Libovisky, who ran the Larry Edmonds bookshop in Hollywood. Libovisky typed up both Nin's and Miller's work in 1950, under the name Press of the Sunken Eye, using 4 carbons, thus producing 5 copies of each book, which he then offered under the titles Oletras and Opus Pistorum, names he probably chose himself. Howard then received a copy of each, probably as a result of the deal. Finally, around 1980, Howard gave his papers, including these 2 books, to UCLA. And that's where I found Oletras more than 30 years later. Life in Provincetown consists of interconnected stories about voyeurism, autoerotic asphyxiation, underage sex, and many other taboos. But like Delta of Venus and Little Birds, it is pure Nin erotica written in a poetic style reminiscent of French literature. Why would Nin choose Provincetown, Massachusetts for the setting of these stories? Probably because she spent a good deal of time there in the summer of 1940 and enjoyed a few amorous adventures of her own, some of which inform her erotica. For example, Nin's secret Peruvian lover, Gonzalo Moret, stayed in a cabin near hers, and they would meet for quick rendezvous in the dead of night. And then she met a Viennese opera singer, Edward Greff, with whom she made love in the sand dunes north of the village. So Provincetown was a perfect setting for the stories. The second book, Marcel, is the full version of the story that was edited down for Delta of Venus. It is likely very close to what she sent Barnett Reuter, so by reading this, the reader gets to see exactly what Nin wrote for $1 a page. It was a matter of transcribing the pages, and most importantly, not to meddle with them. I wanted the reader to see exactly what Nin wrote in 1940, not some polished or bowdlerized version of it. Then came the time to design a cover. It had to be erotic, obviously, and it had to be relevant to Nin in some way. Among Nin's possessions at her Los Angeles home was this erotic card, which, as you may be able to determine, was at one time tacked to a wall. In her diary, Nin tells how, shortly after arriving in Paris in late 1924, she discovered a number of erotic cards and photographs pinned to the walls of an apartment she and her husband subleased from a friend. Was this card one of them? I'd say it's possible, even probable. The card was, therefore, an appropriate piece of art for the cover. So, all was set. It was time to publish. And since Amazon has been one of the major distributors of Sky Blue Press over the years, I went with them along with my other vendors. I can't tell you how excited I was about this. But after submission to Amazon, I began to get some disturbing news from friends and customers. Oletras could not be found on Amazon's website. You had to go through several steps to reach it, something that few customers would be willing to do even if they knew how. So I reached out to Amazon's help desk. Was I in for a shock? It was no error that Oletras was kept in the dark. It was a deliberate attempt by Amazon to keep it invisible, to keep customers from seeing it. In fact, the woman at the help desk informed me that KDP has a policy that discourages adult content books. They don't want to be associated with things like that. I began a long and frustrating experience with Amazon's so-called content committee, which decides what the public sees and under what conditions. I won't belabor this, but I was getting nowhere fast. I turned to social media with my complaint, and one of my Facebook friends, the director and co-creator of Anais, a dance opera, Janet Roston, suggested I go to the press with the story. My first stop was news.com.au, an Australian news agency that my Nin scholar friend Jessica Gilby hooked me up with. To my delight, they not only ran the story, but they contacted Amazon for a comment. News.com.au compared Oletras to Lolita, wondering why one book was preferred over the other. It was great press, but still, Amazon would not release Oletras from their adult content dungeon. The next day, The Guardian published an even more damning article on how Amazon was censoring a book from the most famous erotica writer known to literature. They too asked Amazon for a comment. At the end of that same day, Amazon, without explanation, relented and offered Eletris to the public in the same way they did Nin's other erotica. The battle was won, and the book sold very well on all platforms, Amazon included. Riding on the success of the print and ebook versions, an audiobook was made in 2017. But even that was problematic when the well-known reader I had hired suddenly refused to read Eletris because her partner found one of the stories offensive. But in the end, it got made.
One long main street, running along the bay outline, Portuguese fishermen sitting in circles like the Italians and chatting. Behind the houses on the main street are wharves which project out on the water at various lengths. On these wharves are the huts, shacks, which the fishermen once used to store their nets, tools, and the boats to be repaired. It is here that the artists live. The roofs are peaked and beamed. Everything is...
And when Publishers Weekly ran a terrific review of Eletris, I could finally sit back and enjoy the fact that this book, which had traveled so far across the miles and the years, had finally enjoyed its day in the sun. I'm pretty proud of that.